1954. And a patient, a female patient, is looking out of the window in the French hospital of St. Louis in Jerusalem. We don't know exactly what happened as she stood by the open window. Did she sneeze? Did she cough? Or did she laugh? What we do know is that her false teeth fell out the window and dropped to the ground below. Now, in normal circumstances, not a big deal. One of the staff, one of the nuns, could have gone downstairs, looked for the false teeth, and brought them back to the patient. The trouble is, this was 1954, and the area outside the hospital's wall was a no man's land. It was on the border between what was known as Jewish and Arab Jerusalem. And this particular area was covered with twisted barbed wire, scorched armored vehicles, concrete barriers, landmines, and it was constantly being monitored by snipers from the Arab Legion on the walls of the old city. In November 1948, that's 6 years earlier, 6 months into Israel's War of Independence, Moshe Dayan, who was then the commander of the Israeli forces in Jerusalem, met with his Jordanian counterpart, Abdullah Attal, and together they mapped out where the different positions would be: red for Israel, green for Jordan. And these rough lines on their map became the final ceasefire lines between Israel and Jordan. And the area between those two lines was known as no man's land. So, the French nuns were very insistent that they were going to get back the false teeth. And they badgered the Israeli authorities, and following painstaking international negotiations involving the goodwill of Israel, Jordan, and the United Nations, the chairman of the UN Mixed Armistice Committee held up a white flag and accompanied a nun into the no man's land, and I'm delighted to report that the lost teeth were discovered, and I presume that the patient lived happily ever after. Now, to understand why Moshe Dayan and his Jordanian counterpart sat in November 48 to divide up the Jewish new city and the Arab old city, we need to go back a year earlier to November 1947. The United Nations Partition Plan for Palestine is a proposal before the General Assembly in New York, recommending the end of the British mandate in Palestine and the progressive withdrawal of British armed forces. The proposal also delineates the boundaries of a future Jewish state and a future Arab state. And passage of the resolution requires a 2/3 majority of the valid votes of the United Nations, then 56 member states, not counting abstaining and absent members. And incidentally, Ireland was not yet a member of the United Nations. The plan had already been accepted by the Jewish leadership in Palestine, despite its perceived limitations, but the plan had been decisively rejected by Arab leaders and governments. They were adamantly refusing to accept any form of territorial division. In the days prior to the vote at the United Nations, Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Said said, "We will smash the country with our guns and obliterate every place the Jews seek shelter in." He informed British diplomats that severe measures should be taken against all Jews in Arab countries if the resolution was passed. The Egyptian delegate to the General Assembly, Muhammad Hussein Haikal Pasha, said that the lives of 1 million Jews in Muslim countries would be jeopardized by the establishment of a Jewish state. These threats by the Iraqi and Egyptian spokespeople were, of course, no empty threat. Over the next 3 years, close to 1 million Jews arrived in Israel after being thrown out of the Arab countries they had lived in for thousands of years. The United Nations General Assembly vote finally takes place on the 29th of November 1947. The session in Flushing Meadow, New York, will become one of the key moments in Jewish history. The member states are being asked to cast their votes on Resolution 1812, which recommends the partition of Palestine into 2 separate states. And with just 10 countries left to cast their votes, the situation is still very tense. So far, 27 countries have voted in favor of partition, 11 countries have voted against, and 8 countries have abstained. And in order for the establishment of a Jewish state, a simple majority would not be enough. It had to be a 2/3 majority. The voting continues. Turkey, no. USA, yes. USSR, silence in the hall. Yes. Ukrainian SSR, yes. Union of South Africa, yes. United Kingdom, abstain. Uruguay, yes. Venezuela, yes. Yemen, no. Yugoslavia, abstain. The final vote, the resolution passes by 33 to 13, more than the 2/3 required to have it pass. There is jubilation among the Jewish observers, and an elderly lady I know in Jerusalem, she was 17 years old at the time, and she was a youth delegate sitting in the United Nations General Assembly. As you can imagine, it's a day that she will never forget. She still recalls the electric atmosphere as she witnessed this historic occasion. When news of the vote reaches Palestine, the Jews go out in the streets and dance. And around the world, Jews celebrate the news that they are going to get back their independent state after almost 2,000 years. But the jubilation is short-lived. As soon as the resolution is passed, the Arab nations storm out of the General Assembly, assuring the world that they reject the vote and they will prevent the Jews from creating their own independent Jewish state. This Arab refusal to accept the vote effectively means that the UN resolution has zero practical operational effect. It has no value. It's okay to pass a resolution that there's going to be 2 states, but if one side says we don't accept the resolution or the recommendation, then actually that recommendation is quite meaningless. Even before, but in the meantime, there was a date for the British leaving. So even before the British left Palestine, it was clear that the Jews were going to have to fight for their country. Now, the history books tell us that Israel's War of Independence started in May 1948 with Israel's Declaration of Independence, and that same day the invasion of 5 Arab countries attempting to obliterate the infant Jewish state. But in fact, we can say that the War of Independence began in December 1947, just days after the General Assembly vote. Fighting immediately broke out in Jerusalem between Jewish and Arab militias, with bombings and attacks by both sides. In February 1948, Arab militia blockaded the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Some of you would know that road, the area of Latrun, with bombings and attacks. They blockaded the road, preventing, why? to prevent supplies from getting through from Tel Aviv to the besieged city of Jerusalem. Ambushes by Palestinian and Arab irregulars became more frequent, and the intention was to starve the 100,000 Jewish residents of the city from the rest of the Jewish inhabitants of Palestine. The Scotsman, that's a newspaper, reported that the stated aim of the Arabs was to strangle Jerusalem by a blockade. And in January 1948, the number of trucks supplying Jewish Jerusalem had fallen to 30 per day. By March, the daily average of trucks reaching Jerusalem was 6. By the end of March, it was clear that food supplies for civilians in Jewish Jerusalem would soon run out. One estimate of the size of the opposing forces at the beginning of March 1948 gives the Arabs about 5,300 men in Jerusalem and surrounding district, including 300 Iraqi irregulars and 60 Yugoslav Muslims. Jewish forces included 2,500 Haganah troops, 2,500 Jewish Home Guard, Dad's Army, and 500 members of the dissident Jewish militias. The Arab blockade of Latrun, halfway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, came to an official end in mid-April, and the Jewish militias launched several operations aimed at relieving the Jews in the Old City, because there were Jews outside the Old City, and there was a cluster of Jews in the Old City of Jerusalem. The British mandate came to an end on May the 14th, marking the end of British rule that had begun 30 years earlier when General Edmund Allenby entered the city in 1917. The last British High Commissioner was Dublin-born, I didn't know this until I was doing my research, General Alan Cunningham, who had been relieved of his post as commander of the 8th Army in North Africa in mid-battle in 1941. It gives us some indication of the competence of the man. Appointed British High Commissioner in 1945, he had the unenviable task of trying to keep the peace between the Jews and the Arabs and to keep Holocaust refugees from reaching Palestine. We see a hint of his personal biases in this dispatch that he sent to the Foreign Office in London 2 weeks before he left Palestine. Discussing the way the Jews celebrated military successes, he described their broadcasts, both in content and in manner of delivery, as being remarkably like those of Nazi Germany. On the night of May the 14th, Cunningham flew from Calandia Aerodrome, 10 kilometers north of Jerusalem. He flew to Haifa, and at midnight on May the 15th, he sailed out of the territorial waters of the Jewish state of Israel that had been announced some hours earlier by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. We may be forgiven if we imagined that Cunningham's departure marked the disappearance of British officers in Palestine. We would be very wrong. Jordan's army, known as the Arab Legion, was commanded by a British officer, Lieutenant General Sir John Glubb, also known as Glubb Pasha. Glubb, Brigadier Norman Lash, and 46 other British Army officers led, trained, and equipped the Arab Legion, which Britain was funding to the tune of £2.5 million per year, a huge amount of money in 1948. Glubb Pasha later wrote it had been the British Foreign Office policy to keep Abdullah, that's the King of Jordan, short of ammunition, a policy designed to act as a curb to any possible ambitions he might have, and also to prevent his sudden attacking one of his rivals. In the early evening of May the 15th, while 4 other Arab states invaded Israel, the Arab Legion crossed the River Jordan by the Allenby Bridge and reached Jericho and went on to Ramallah. At first, Abdullah only wanted to deploy his troops in the area of Palestine dedicated to the Arab state. the Jordanian troops did not at first enter Jerusalem. Instead, they massively garrisoned Latrun. We're back to Latrun now, on the road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, in order to once again blockade the Jewish city. The day that the British forces departed from Jerusalem, Haganah forces captured various neighborhoods in Jewish Jerusalem. This prompted Abdullah to order the Arab Legion to send a company to the Old City and prepare for an offensive against the Jewish quarter. The Arab Legion armored column made its way from Ramallah into the Damascus Gate, where it planned to link up with Arab irregular forces fighting inside the Old City. The same day, Egyptian forces made their way up from Bethlehem in the south, from where they planned to break through to Jerusalem and join up with the Jordanian forces. The Arab Legion fired 10,000 artillery and mortar shells a day into Jewish Jerusalem, and also used sniper fire to cause civilian casualties. There was considerable embarrassment from the UK government that British officers were so directly involved in the hostilities. One British member of Parliament even demanded that Glubb be arrested for serving in a foreign army without the King's permission. All the British officers were ordered to return to Transjordan, which led to the bizarre spectacle of British officers leaving their units. But don't worry, every one of the British officers sneaked back across the border and rejoined the Arab Legion. The British officers of the Arab Legion ordered heavy daily mortar and artillery bombardment of Notre Dame Monastery, located strategically on high ground on the boundary between the Old City and the Jewish part of the New City. Built at the end of the 19th century, this massive Catholic compound was among the largest buildings in Jerusalem. 2 Haganah militias were responsible for helping defend Notre Dame. The Jonathan platoon, made up of youngsters below military age, and members of the Gadna youth organization that consisted of teenagers called up because of the shortage of fighting men in beleaguered Jerusalem. On May the 15th, Gadna members were sent to rebuild positions that the Jordanians had blown up in this very large Notre Dame monastery. Iraqi volunteers working with the Jordanian Arab Legion tried to take control of Notre Dame, but Haganah fighters recaptured the monastery. And we now come to the story of a 16-year-old Jerusalem schoolboy who, unbeknownst to his family, was an active member of the Gadna youth organization. He ran away from school, found his way to Notre Dame, where he was deployed in passing messages among the different firing positions in Notre Dame. Suddenly he spotted a crate with about 10 bottles. He recognized them as Molotov cocktails left behind by the Iraqi irregulars. He hid the crate. A week later, on the morning of the 20th of May, he and his friends were fortifying a firing position with sandbags when the walls of Notre Dame trembled under the impact of renewed Jordanian shelling. One of his friends suddenly pointed excitedly to the road below. A Jordanian armored vehicle had managed to break into Notre Dame and had taken up a position below the windows of the monastery. In other words, breaking through from the old city into the new city. "Quick," yelled the friend, "where are the bottles?" The schoolboy brought the crate over. Now, he'd been trained in handling a Sten rifle and parabellum pistol, but he'd never thrown a Molotov cocktail. "Throw one," urged his friend. "How?" asked the schoolboy. His friend showed him and lobbed the Molotov cocktail in an arc from the second floor down towards the armored vehicle. It missed. Imitating him, the schoolboy threw a Molotov cocktail for the first time in his life. It hit the lead Jordanian armored vehicle, which immediately burst into flames. the entire Jordanian armoured column came to an abrupt halt on the narrow road. They couldn't get past the immobilised vehicle, and the other vehicles just turned round, beat a hasty retreat, and regrouped at the Damascus gate. Everyone present that day at the Battle of Notre Dame knew that a Molotov cocktail had prevented the Jordanians from invading Jewish Jerusalem. The story of the boy who threw the Molotov cocktail and saved Jewish Jerusalem spread rapidly, but no one knew the boy's name. The blonde boy, as the fighters in Notre Dame described him, entered the history books of the War of Independence and became part of Jerusalem mythology. Some people even thought that the whole story was fake news. And for several decades, the identity of the boy remained a mystery. 23 fighters fell in that battle for Notre Dame, the battle that saved Jewish Jerusalem. Some of you will have read the 1972 book O Jerusalem by Dominique Lapierre and Larry Collins. They spent years interviewing, researching, and reading public documents in order to create an account of the birth of Israel, and they mention in the book the story of the blonde boy and the Molotov cocktail. An official history from the Israeli army of the battle relates as follows. The Arab Legion's main target that day was Notre Dame Monastery, located on a hill overlooking Damascus Gate. The Jewish forces occupying the monastery posed a threat to Legion units in the Damascus Gate area, who were guarding the route from the Old City to Sheikh Jarrah and from there to Ramallah. During the Legion's first attempt to capture Notre Dame, a column of armoured cars proceeded towards the monastery under cover of heavy shelling. Behind the armoured cars, the infantry began its onslaught. But a Molotov cocktail hurled from the second floor of the monastery hit their front car, set it alight, thus halting the entire column. The defenders of the monastery opened fire, and the Legion was forced to retreat. Losses included the Legion commander and 4 armoured cars. The repulsion of the Legion attack at Notre Dame did much to raise the spirits of the Jewish defenders. However, events over the weeks following the battle for Notre Dame gradually obscured and overshadowed the battle. The Arab Legion deployed in the Old City expelled all the residents and soldiers from the Jewish quarter and the rest of the Old City. Fighting in Jerusalem did not resume, and as we saw earlier, the ceasefire lines drawn up by Moshe Dayan and his Jordanian counterpart in November that year, 48, came into force. And they were still in force when the hospital patient lost her full teeth. For the 19 years between 1948 and 1967, Jerusalem was divided between Israel and Jordan, Israel ruling West Jerusalem, Jordan ruling East Jerusalem. Several other factors helped to further obscure and overshadow the 1948 Battle of Notre Dame. First of all, there was the battle for Jerusalem in the 1967 Six-Day War, followed by the reunification of Jerusalem, and of course, the disappearance of no man's land. All this sort of pushed the Battle of Notre Dame into relative obscurity. Fast forward to the early 1980s, one of my younger brothers was courting a Jerusalem maiden. As the elder brother, I went along to meet the family, and that is how I first met a leading Hebrew University professor, Mordechai Rottenberg. He was born in Wrocław, Germany, today Wrocław in Poland, where his father owned a large printing press and publishing house. After witnessing Kristallnacht in 1938, Mordechai and the rest of his ultra-Orthodox family managed to escape to Palestine in 1939. Mordechai's father opened a small printing press in Jerusalem, and after the 1948 War of Independence, Mordechai worked there with his father. In 1949, Mordechai was drafted into the newly formed Israel Defence Forces, and as part of his military service, he took part in cross-border reprisal raids. After his army service, Mordechai became a physical education teacher and studied for his matriculation exams at night. He worked for a while as an actor with Israel Radio, where he was the voice of Winnie the Pooh and the voice of the police officer in the Paul Temple detective series. While working as a probation officer at the welfare ministry, he started studying at the Hebrew University. He embarked on a prestigious academic career and became a professor at the Hebrew University and in Berkeley, California. He was a recipient of the highly prestigious Israel Prize, it's the highest honor anybody in Israel can achieve, for his contribution to social work, and he won the Jerusalem Prize, also very prestigious honor, for study of Jewish thought. 12 years ago, together with my sister-in-law, his daughter, he founded the Rothenberg Center for Jewish Psychology, named after Mordechai's son Boaz, who fell while on active service in the army. A few years ago, Professor Mordechai Rothenberg was minding his own business, leafing through a small publication about the War of Independence in Jerusalem. He suddenly came across the story of the Battle of Notre Dame. And there in black and white, he read about the anonymous 16-year-old blonde Gadna boy who saved the Hebrew city of Jerusalem by preventing the Arab Legion from breaking into the Jewish neighborhoods. Hang on, he said to himself, that's me they're writing about. I am the blonde boy who threw the Molotov cocktail. And at about this same period, maybe 10, 12 years ago, Professor Rothenberg was experiencing a less welcome reminder of the Notre Dame battle. Small pieces of shrapnel that had lodged in his leg over 60 years earlier were now making it difficult for him to walk. Let's go back to the Battle of Notre Dame. The evening after he threw the Molotov cocktail, Mordechai returned to his family for supper on Usishkin Street to his family. And naturally he didn't mention the Molotov cocktail. In order to hide from his family that he was absconding from school and playing an active role in the Gadna, he had long since become adept at spinning stories and inventing excuses for his absences. Not only didn't he tell his parents that day about the Molotov cocktail, he told nobody else either. And for decades, the only people who heard about that story were his wife and his children. Now that he discovered that his exploits at Notre Dame had entered Israeli mythology, Mordechai embarked on a quest to identify witnesses who could verify that he was the blonde boy who threw the Molotov cocktail. At first, his quest was fruitless. During the Notre Dame battle, there was little eye contact between the various positions, so the professor could find no one to identify him. He said in a later interview, I was afraid people would not believe me. I was afraid they would think I was a fantasist seeking glory and publicity. And then Professor Mordechai Rothenberg met Edna Brill, an educational psychologist whose father had died as a result of the injuries in the Battle for Notre Dame. And before he went into surgery, which he did not survive, the father had told his sister about the Molotov cocktail that had stopped the Jordanian armored column. And when Edna Brill started gathering testimonies about the battle, she knew this story very well. And then she met Mordechai Rothenberg and immediately realized from the details he related, she had indeed found the blonde boy from the stories. Edna introduced him to a guy called Reuven Kastel, a Haggadah man who had also been fighting at Notre Dame. Kastel immediately recognized him. He says, the picture of the kid with the Molotov cocktail and the burning Jordanian armored car never left me. I was placed in the front post opposite the new gate in the old city walls. We saw the legionnaires and their armored vehicles. Suddenly we saw the lead armored vehicle burst into flames in the yard just below us after the blonde boy threw his Molotov cocktail. Over the past several years, Edna and the public committee of interested individuals that she started, which included Professor Rothenberg, lobbied for a public commemoration of those who fell in the Battle of Notre Dame. The idea was to build a dignified monument that would tell the story of the fallen soldiers. Finally, last month, in May, as part of Israel's 70th anniversary celebrations, an unveiling ceremony was held in Jerusalem's IDF Square to commemorate the heroes of the Battle of Notre Dame. Jerusalem Mayor Nir Barakat told the large audience, which included dozens of people who had participated in the battle, "If the walls of Jerusalem could speak, they would tell us about the lads who ran away from school in order to participate in the battle for Jerusalem. If the streets of Jerusalem could speak, they would tell us of the heroism of the fighters who saw the column of armored cars coming towards them and knew that the fate of Jerusalem rested on their shoulders. And so I say to you, the fighters of Notre Dame, every stone in Jerusalem salutes you and your comrades who did not survive the battle. Thank you for saving Jerusalem." And who do you think was chosen to address the audience on behalf of the fighters present at the ceremony? Yes, it was Professor Mordechai Rothenberg. There was not a dry eye as he described the fateful and bloody battle. The blonde hero of the Battle of Notre Dame was finally receiving public recognition and public thanks for saving Jewish Jerusalem 70 years ago. Thank you.